Did you know that pleasure is not only good for connecting with our partners, having a better sex life, but it's also essential to our well being, for our health, for our sleep, digestion, learning, for all those things. If we tap into more pleasure, we can feel better, we can have a better life, more aliveness, more connection with others. And there's a science behind the brain that feels pleasure, releasing hormones and neurotransmitters that are responsible for all this cocktail of well-being. So today we're going to dive into these hormones and neurotransmitters, and also we're going to explain a brief practice, about 5-10 minutes practice, that is going to help us to tap into more pleasure in our daily lives. I'm Emela Bear, I'm a sacred sexuality coach, and I help people to connect deeply with their bodies, releasing all blockages, taboos, and everything that is preventing them to really connect with their erotic potential. Sometimes we think that pleasure is just for sexual connection and it's hedonistic. But when we talk about pleasure, there is much more to that. It's also beneficial for our minds, for our bodies, for our emotions. And the more we connect to pleasure, the more we rewire our brains to be in connection with pleasure and to have a pleasure bias. We know that we normally have a negative bias. It means that we tend to see the world in negative eyes. We wake up in the morning and probably we have the tendency to feel what is wrong, how tired we are. We can feel the constriction in our hearts, and we can see things in a negative light. And that's how our brains are wired, to have a negative bias. But we can train our brains to actually have a positive bias. And this is not to say that we're just going to have positive thinking, not at all. But with actually a positive bias and diving deep into pleasure and finding pleasure in our bodies all the time, we can also endure and actually navigate life in a more easeful way. Also the problems, also the pain. And the reason for that is that we're releasing certain hormones and neurotransmitters when we connect to pleasure. And this could be sexual pleasure and also a walk in nature, connecting with friends, listening to a beautiful piece of music. It doesn't need to be necessarily sexual pleasure, but it's true that with orgasm, there is a cocktail of hormones that we actually release. And there are 4 hormones and neurotransmitters that are really important for our well-being and for our pleasure. And those are serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. And all of these 4 really secure us to have well-being, to feel joy, to have better sleep, better digestion, to learn faster, and to actually increase our memory. Oxytocin is called the love hormone because it's released in large quantities after childbirth for the mother to connect deeply with their newborn. It also is released in different stages of falling in love of the relationship, actually in later stages, which actually allows the couple to really bond, to have really a deep intimacy, to have a connection. Oxytocin is more calm, it's really good for connecting. It's necessary for us to bond, to feel trust in others, but also in ourselves, to feel secure in our bodies. And when we tap into pleasure, and I'm going to actually just describe a brief practice of self-pleasure for the mornings, and we take 5 or 10 minutes for that, we're going to actually release oxytocin, which is going to make us feel more connected, with more trust, with more safety in our bodies. And this by only tapping for 5 minutes a day. Then we have serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is very important because it's related to the secretion of melatonin. And melatonin is responsible for regulating our sleep cycle. When we have healthy levels of serotonin in our body, we have better sleep, a better digestion, our capacity of learning improves, and also our memory. That is responsible for our well-being, because if we're not sleeping well and we are not digesting well, our life can be really disturbed. So we can see, if we actually have a self-pleasure practice, or we have a healthy relationship with pleasure inside our bodies, how this neurotransmitter can be released, and it's really positive for all the things I mentioned before. Then there is also the endorphins, and the endorphins are really good for pain relief, and also for controlling stress. It's a natural painkiller, let's put it that way. And so endorphins are also secreted, released by our brains when we tap into pleasure, which means that actually we are going to have a better relationship with pain and stress. If we don't have good levels of endorphins in our brains, we're going to actually feel much more stress, which can lead to anxiety, phobias, and other disorders. So it's really important to have a healthy balance of endorphins. And with a pleasure practice, it's actually scientifically proven that there is a good amount of release of endorphins. And the last one is dopamine. And dopamine is really interesting. There is actually a whole book that talks about dopamine that is called Dopamine Nation, a really interesting book, which talks about our society being addicted to dopamine. Dopamine is released in the first stages of falling in love, which makes us feel really passionate, like even in euphoria. And that's the reason why sometimes some people are addicted to falling in love. They are not really looking for bonding necessarily, but they are looking for this moment, this rush of dopamine in the body. And that also explains why so many people are addicted to social media or to gambling or pornography, because that releases dopamine in our brains. But I think there's actually a way to connect and release dopamine in a healthier way, which is actually connecting with our own bodies. We have the tendency in this society to really look for external stimuli to lead us to pleasure. We're actually very hedonistic in that sense. We're always looking for something external to really fulfill us. And I think the reason why I'm also talking about this is because one of the things that I always talk about is that we are complete as we are, that we have everything we need in order to be fulfilled, happy, and have the well-being we actually want. So when we actually see that all these hormones are actually present in the body, of course, evidently, and by tapping into pleasure, we can release them in a healthy way, and it's going to actually balance our moods, going to balance also our sleep, our digestion. We can see that we have the keys and everything for our well-being. And so dopamine, it's really important and interesting because we have the tendency to actually look for external things to really fulfill us and find this passion. But I think if we have a healthy relationship with our bodies, we can find that passion within, releasing dopamine again, but we are not looking for something outside. We're actually just connecting with our bodies in a way that it's increasing the pleasure and the sensation of pleasure, which is going to show us that there is nothing outside from us that we need to look for. And so that leads actually to the practice that I want to talk about, which is a really short practice. It could be done in 5 or 10 minutes. And especially if we do it in the mornings or before we go to bed, it's really beneficial because it sets up the day. And it gives also a positive bias for the day. And so we can wake up, we can lie down, or we can sit up straight. And what we can do for 5 or 10 minutes is a body scan. I described that in a video before. And a body scan will allow us to find the most pleasurable place in our bodies at a certain moment. So we can scan the body and just find pleasure, where pleasure resides in a specific moment. And that don't necessarily is the genitals, it could be something else, and it could be really subtle. For example, in this moment, what I'm feeling is that my pleasure is actually here in my chest heart area. And so I will find that, and then for the rest of the time, let's say 4 minutes, I'm going to be with that part, in the sense that I'm going to increase, just with my awareness and my focus, the sensation of pleasure. And just by putting our focus there, the sensations will increase. And then we can incorporate, for example, a touch. It could be a slight touch, it could be more pressure, and we can see if that increases or decreases the pleasure. And then we can also maybe implement some movement and see if that increases or decreases the pleasure. And like that, we can see that with only 5 minutes of trying that and doing that, of course, every day or consistently, we can not only help our brains to find pleasure quicker, but also we're going to have a positive bias, a pleasure bias, and we're going to see that really there is no much to do outside, that we can actually just dive within and find the treasure within. So that is the practice. It's really simple. So it's a body scan, localizing the most pleasurable sensation in the body at that time. And that could be very subtle. It doesn't need to be an explosion of ecstasy. It could be, though. And then increasing the pleasure with the focus, with the elements of breath, movement, and touch. And there is nothing to do. There is no orgasm to reach. There is no even genital touch necessarily. So it's just an awareness. And that is also going to help us in our daily life to be in connection with our bodies, with our pleasure, feel the things, feel the environment around us, touching us and moving us inside. And that's why I wanted to talk about this, because since we are very driven to find external things really appealing and think and believe that the thing that I'm chasing is going to actually relieve me and give me joy, that's not necessarily true. And all that dopamine that I'm actually having from falling in love or gambling or being in social media, and actually it could create an addiction there, we can turn that inwards, and we can actually feel the health and the vibrancy and aliveness of our own bodies. So we have the 4: oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, and dopamine, that are actually a cocktail of hormones and neurotransmitters that our brains naturally release when we tap into pleasure. So if you like this video, give a like. You can follow me on social media, and if you're interested in one-on-one mentorships, you can click the links below.